Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is David Godwin, and I'm the director of the Southern Fire Exchange Program with the University of Florida. And from our team today, I'm joined by Marinelle Armstrong with the University of Florida and Tall Timbers Research Station. We're excited that you're joining us today, and I think you're going to enjoy our presentation from our speakers. We have Dr. Jesse Abrams, Destin Key, and Ty Aldworth, and today they're going to be talking about their research analyzing the U.S. Forest Service Shared Stewardship Program in the eastern half of the United States. So finally, without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce our three speakers today. Dr. Jesse Abrams is an assistant professor of natural resource policy and sustainability at the Warnell School of Forestry and Natural Resources and the Savannah River Ecology Laboratory at the University of Georgia. He holds a PhD and MS degrees in forest resources from Oregon State University and a BA in environmental studies from New College of Florida. His research focuses on collaborative, community-based, and networked approaches to natural resource governance and policy implementation. His work has focused on forest and rangeland landscapes from the Pacific Northwest all the way to Argentina. Destin Key, our next speaker, is a graduate research assistant at the University of Georgia. She's pursuing a MS degree in forest policy and sustainability. She's studying the application of shared stewardship strategy, as we'll hear about today, in the eastern United States. Her interests are based on the political and social dimensions of natural resource management. She previously earned a BS degree in forest resources from the University of Georgia. And finally, we'll hear from Ty Aldworth. Ty is a member of the Public Lands Policy Group and a master's student at Colorado State University, studying cross-boundary forest management projects under the banner of shared stewardship. Previously, he received an undergraduate degree in forestry from the University of Montana. He's interested in finding ways to increase the pace and scale of forest restoration activities across the United States. So thank you so much. Welcome, Ty, Jesse, and Destin. We're so glad that you're here with us today. Excited to share your research with folks across the eastern US. And so one moment, everyone, as we just trade out presentations.
So I'm Jesse Abrams. I'm here with Destin Key, and Ty Aldworth will be kind of joining remotely from Colorado in a moment. And as David said, what we're here to talk about is essentially the early sort of implementation of this shared stewardship initiative in lands and landscapes east of the Rocky Mountains. And so this research project comes out of essentially a larger project headed up by Courtney Schultz at the Public Lands Policy Group at Colorado State University. Chad Koistra is working with her in that capacity. I'm a co-PI in the project along with Heidi Huber-Stearns out of the University of Oregon. Essentially, the idea here is that shared stewardship is a kind of a somewhat recent policy initiative announced in late 2018 that emphasizes this notion of planning and implementing in partnership between the federal government and various partners in the landscapes in which the federal government works, particularly between the U.S. Forest Service and states, tribes, non-governmental organizations, and other collaborators. And the idea is to sort of collectively identify priorities, coordinate efforts, and try to sort of share capacity to implement fire restoration and forest management projects. Unlike some other policies that have come out in recent years, shared stewardship doesn't come with, let's say, a dedicated pot of money or specific new policy levers or tools. What it is, in a sense, is sort of a statement of intent, and that the policy is put into action via these MOUs, these memoranda of understanding, that are signed between individual states and the federal government. And so you can see in the map here, kind of at the bottom right, the states that have signed to date. There are 28 of those that have signed an MOU with either the Forest Service or USDA, basically committing to implementing shared stewardship. Those MOUs tend to identify the sorts of priorities and commitments made. There are also 3 alliances that have signed MOUs under shared stewardship. That'd be the Western Governors Association, the Northeast and Midwest State Foresters Alliance, and various states in the Chesapeake Bay watershed. And you can find more about the Shared Stewardship Initiative at the website listed below. So essentially, the intent behind shared stewardship, I'll talk a little bit about where it came from. To some extent, it came out of the fire funding fix, which Congress passed a couple of years ago as a way to try to prevent large fires from continually eating into the Forest Service budget. And so the idea is that year after year, the Forest Service was having to spend a lot of its non-fire budget to respond to these very large wildfires, and it was creating all kinds of problems, obviously, for the non-fire programs. So the idea here was that Congress passed a fix allowing at least some of those costs for the large fires to be absorbed by another fund. But as part of that, Congress essentially wanted the Forest Service to show that it was kind of doing all the proactive steps that were needed to reduce overall costs and impacts associated with those large wildfires. And so shared stewardship, as I said, it's not a legislative policy. It's not even necessarily a change to kind of executive level rules or regulations. What it is it's a kind of a statement of intent. It's sort of a vision statement that builds on a lot of prior initiatives, some of which were passed through legislation, others of which were passed through executive actions. And so those are policies like the Good Neighbor Authority, which essentially allow state agencies to perform certain types of activities on national forest land, Collaborative Forest Landscape Restoration Program, the stewardship contracting, as well as a few other initiatives that sort of work in the spirit of sort of a landscape scale, cross-boundary focus on restoration. And the idea was also to increase that state engagement, which was already there, had already been sort of promoted through some of these prior policies, and to really elevate the role of science in making these decisions across the landscape. So in terms of the kinds of priorities identified through this process, through kind of the national rollout of shared stewardship, the idea was really to increase the pace and scale of work, particularly that forest restoration work, to address these persistent capacity limitations, particularly in some of the federal agencies that had struggled to implement all the projects that they had wanted to implement. And like I said, to do a strategic prioritization to really make sure that the projects that were being planned and implemented had the maximum impact on the landscape. So this particular project that we're a part of, I'll just briefly say, this came out of discussions with U.S. Forest Service leadership and partners as the shared stewardship strategy started to get rolled out. We started with kind of an early project funded with the Rocky Mountain Research Station, and that was then kind of rolled into a larger agreement with state and private forestry, the U.S. Forest Service. And essentially the idea here is to track shared stewardship implementation over time. So it's a 5-year research project. And what we've done for the first couple of years, as I'll explain in a moment, is just to get a very early sort of pulse on how people, both at the national, state levels, as well as other partner organizations and agencies, how they perceive the initiative, kind of what they see as the opportunities, as well as challenges that might come up in implementation. And so our phase 1, which we essentially conducted in 2020, focused on the Western states. And so we looked at states that had already signed an MOU with the national government at that point, with Forest Service or USDA. We talked to a lot of shared stewardship oriented folks in the Forest Service and in partner agencies at the national level. And then we did a series of state level studies. And essentially in year 2, which was last year, 2021, we then shifted, kind of took a similar approach, but focused on the Eastern states. And the idea was that the Western states were really the early adopters. Many of the first states to sign these MOUs were in the West. Eastern states were a little bit slower in signing those MOUs. So in this phase 2, which we're going to report on today, again, some initial conversations with folks at the state level and with some of these partner agencies and organizations, as well as with people from the private industry. Again, just getting that kind of early read on how they see the shared stewardship initiative, what they see as the opportunities, what they see as the challenges. And so at this point, we've published a working paper from year 1, another working paper from year 2. We did a webinar last year based on our phase 1 findings, and this is our phase 2 webinar. Kind of looking forward, we're going to continue to kind of track the implementation of this initiative over the next 3 years. At this point, shifting more to looking at case studies, so specific projects that are planned either under shared stewardship or kind of in the spirit of shared stewardship, and then to determine what the appropriate scope is for any follow-up work. And we'll continue to essentially produce additional research products during that time. So as I said, that phase one approach, I'll just briefly say, 177 semi-structured interviews with 127 people. Again, you can see here both at the national level and at the state level with folks in 10 different states. This is the report, the working paper that came out of that. You can find it here on this website, at the Public Lands Policy Group website. The phase two approach, very similar in the sense that it's focused on these semi-structured interviews. We chose these 7 states that you see here: Arkansas, Florida, Georgia, Nebraska, North Carolina, Massachusetts, and Texas. These were essentially the 7 states that east of the Rockies that had signed the MOU by the time we started this research in phase two. And the idea is to look at essentially contacting the people that were part of the MOUs, line officers on the appropriate national forests, any partners involved in sort of advisory committees, collaborative groups, folks in the industry, and any of the partners. And the idea is essentially to use this as I said, as an early look to get a kind of an initial pulse on how people were perceiving this initiative and what they saw moving forward. And again, this is the practitioner paper which you can get at that same website from the Public Lands Policy Group. So the research questions, I'll just briefly go over this, and I'll hand it off to Destin to talk about our findings. So first research question is, we wanted to know, how is the strategy playing out in different states? And what are some of the factors that are influencing how it plays out in those different states, particularly related to any sort of strategic partnerships or directions for planning and implementation. Again, as I said, what are the opportunities and challenges associated with implementing the strategy? What do people at these various agencies, organizations, and businesses, what do they see as kind of the path forward for kind of realizing this vision? What are the challenges that might stand in the way? To what extent are we actually seeing changes in things like strategies, collaborative efforts, planning, implementation compared with business as usual? Now, we recognize that this is still very much in its early stages, so we weren't expecting to see a lot at this point, but it is a question we asked even in our early interviews. We're interested in prioritization, so how are priorities being set? So what kinds of authorities are being used for prioritization? What sorts of collaborative forums, scientific tools, et cetera? Any sort of changes related to things like new policies, new incentives, new capacities, new ways of measuring outcomes might be needed to actually move forward with shared stewardship. And then finally, what are some of the political opportunities and challenges? We see shared stewardship certainly as elevating the role of the state. And so this is a potential shift, and we wanted to see from different people's perspectives how this might change kind of political opportunities and challenges. So with that, I will turn it over to Destin, and she'll take it from here. And then, as I said, Ty will take over and do a kind of comparison of our Western and Eastern states towards the end of this presentation. So go ahead and take it away, Destin.
Hi, thank you, Jesse. So I'm just going to be talking about some of the findings we found. And we'll be looking at these 5 findings. So the first one being just goals for shared stewardship, the interviewees, their intent for why they signed those MOUs, as well as any cross-boundary efforts that preceded shared stewardship that might play out with implementation in the future, any progress to date at the time of interviews, as well as any prioritization processes existing or new ones that might be coming up in the future. And finally, any opportunities and challenges that interviewees felt. So many of our interviewees felt that the goals for shared stewardship are really just to better existing efforts. And one interviewee from Arkansas said, the intent for being to better focus efforts across federal, state, and private land boundaries to better meet the goals of our forest resources and resource concerns in the areas. This shared stewardship agreement is kind of almost seemed redundant because the agencies and NGOs and all of the interested parties already worked very well together to do this and had been for quite a while. So as I said, a lot of our interviewees spoke about how shared stewardship was more, rather a shift in principle, it was more so a shift in intent or rhetoric. Also, a lot of our interviewees felt that it was the next logical step, signing the MOU and getting something more formalized for these efforts amongst agencies. They felt another goal was to increase the coordination across jurisdictions for joint prioritization. Like Jesse mentioned, the increase in pace of scale was a big motivator. Specifically in these states that differs from the Western states that we'll talk about later is just the amount of private landowners and how to reach a landscape scale management, it will be important to include some of those private partners as well. Another goal that interviewees felt were the potential to generate economic activity, and Region 8, a lot of that was around timber production, but also in Nebraska and Massachusetts, there were conversations about how these efforts might be able to generate more economic activity where it doesn't already exist. And again, many interviewees felt that shared stewardship was an umbrella to expand on the efforts that were already occurring for cross-boundary efforts. One example of this was in Massachusetts. In Massachusetts, one of the primary drivers for signing an MOU was the Mohawk Trail Woodlands Partnership, which is an effort to increase conservation and economic stability in 21 towns in Western Massachusetts. This is an effort where the U.S. Forest Service is a non-voting consultant, which is they're just trying to help further these actions and prioritization in this part of that state. Next, the cross-boundary efforts that preceded shared stewardship. A lot of our interviewees spoke about things that were already existing that would help further the intent of shared stewardship. And one interviewee from North Carolina said, before shared stewardship, there was the Good Neighbor Agreement. And there have been a number of projects in North Carolina tied to the Good Neighbor Authority. There's opportunity under shared stewardship, but there were also some things that were already in the works under the Good Neighbor Authority. A lot of our interviewees spoke about how key partners and stakeholders have historically worked together on a lot of these initiatives. In Massachusetts and Nebraska, this history was a little bit less extensive, and so they looked to shared stewardship to increase these relationships for further cross-boundary work. A lot of our interviews also, again, highlighted some of those cross-boundary projects and initiatives that were existing. In North Carolina, interviewees spoke about the All Lands Project in Western North Carolina and those cross-boundary initiatives for conservation and land management in that part of the state, as well as a lot of the Region 8 states mentioned the Longleaf Alliance and reinstating longleaf in its historical areas. And lastly, shared stewardship was also felt to be supported by existing federal authorities such as Good Neighbor Agreement, Cooperative Forest Landscape Restoration Partnership, as well as the Joint Chiefs Landscape Restoration Partnership. Next is progress to date. So most interviewees felt any changes from shared stewardship were more conceptual around the intentions or formality of land management. However, there were some notable state changes, which included the Region 8 Shared Stewardship Coordinator, who really encouraged these MOUs to get signed and encouraged some progress for shared stewardship in the region, as well as a new shared stewardship position in Florida, which is a Florida Fish and Wildlife Commission position on the Osceola National Forest, which is funded by the U.S. Forest Service, or partly funded by the U.S. Forest Service. In Nebraska, there's a new joint U.S. Forest Service and Nebraska Forest Service Shared Stewardship Steering Committee to promote some efforts in that state. And lastly, in Massachusetts, again, in relation to the Mohawk Trail Woodlands Partnership, state legislature was able to pass a bill recognizing that initiative. So at the time of interviews, interviewees noted that there had not been much action towards implementation yet, and they highlighted a need for more direction and resources on what would be the next steps to start implementing this. Some interviewees mentioned a lack of communication from leadership, agency leadership, to partners about expectations and what the next step after the signing the MOU might be in these states under current conditions. And also, it's important to note that we were conducting these interviews in the middle of a pandemic where priorities may have been shifted away from land management activities, and meeting in person was obviously not as prominent during those times. So in regards to prioritization processes, a lot of our interviewees felt that there were already existing prioritization processes, but that shared stewardship could better those going forward. One interviewee from Georgia said, at a much broader scale, we all continue to struggle with prioritizing our work. The lack of resources to accomplish work forces us to make pretty tough decisions daily. So this shared stewardship agreement will help decide how we might be able to create space to focus more or integrate it more into things we are already doing. Again, these interviewees felt that joint prioritization was already existing in these states, and they had been practicing joint prioritization for years through these longstanding practices of interagency and partner communications, specifically through processes like the creation of the state forest action plans and wildlife action plans in these states, where the agencies head up the process, but look to outside partners to help with certain expertise sections of where the priorities might be in the state. Also, it's important that these prioritization processes consider social factors. So many of these consider things like existing and local relationships and what might be important to those partners outside of these agencies and how they can integrate that into their plans, as well as capacity to actually do the work. And specifically in the eastern part of the state where there's more part of the nation where there's more private land ownership, it's important to consider buy-in and initiative from private landowners in these processes. So in regards to opportunities and challenges, many interviewees saw a lot of opportunities under shared stewardship, such as this interviewee from Georgia who says, we've had this scattered shotgun approach in the past where it's almost as if we're having these random acts of conservation across the landscape. So having a greater awareness will help us to better leverage the resources that we have. Many interviewees felt that it would be really beneficial to have shared stewardship be more of a formal way to better align objectives. So removing some of the redundancy in the efforts that they're already doing, as well as pinpointing the areas where agencies still work independently and any capacity that maybe they could work together better in the future to better align objectives statewide. Another opportunity interviewees saw was including forest industry and private lands more into plans and initiatives and agreements. So things like efforts that could give resilience to the markets and infrastructure, specifically timber and Region 8 and some of these other eastern states, as well as increasing the outreach to private landowners and including industry representation in conversations about cross-boundary management. Another opportunity that interviewees saw was to just improve the existing partnerships. So to embrace more of a collaborative mindset, to have more sharing of accountability and responsibility amongst partners, to enhance coordination so that they're leveraging resources in a more effective manner, include more partners and expand partnerships past where they are currently, to continue to maintain existing relationships and local involvement, as well as having a space for shared learning and partnership building within the umbrella of shared stewardship. And in regards to relationships, one interviewee from Arkansas said, like it or not, the world runs on relationships, and shared stewardship is a little more formal way to build relationships and trust. The only way you can build relationships and trust is to do stuff together, do projects together. And that's the important piece. And that's the beauty of the shared stewardship agreement. It gives us a vehicle to do stuff together. Aside from those opportunities I just mentioned, there were some challenges that interviewees highlighted. The first one being the need for more structures to support shared stewardship implementation. Many interviewees mentioned the need for maybe more shared stewardship specific positions like a state level shared stewardship coordinator, that aside from the regional level, a state level shared stewardship coordinator could help with specific efforts in these states, as well as advisory committees or other committees that kind of promote effort towards implementation in the future. The next challenge that was highlighted was leadership. So having more clear communication of expectations and intentions from these leaders, and more of a shift in mindset to support new approaches going forward from leadership. And all of these being things that would support the longevity of shared stewardship and having more successful partnerships going forward. And then another challenge that was highlighted by interviewees was their thoughts on past experiences and the dynamics existing between, or the internal agency dynamics that are existing. So there was some hesitation from some of the interviews that we spoke to about increasing work with the U.S. Forest Service beyond what they currently do, just because of the inevitable kind of bureaucratic red tape associated with increasing work and having more responsibility or authority on projects. A lot of the state agencies were concerned with the authority to take like an equal or a lead role in management activities aside from just being an outside partner. Just wondering if there was more space for equal or lead roles in some of these projects going forward that are across boundaries, as well as, again, just leadership and clear communication from within the agency and consistency across units. So just to kind of wrap up our findings, these are just 5 key takeaways that we felt were kind of the most important thing to grasp from everything I just spoke about. The first one being that shared stewardship will largely serve to just expand and formalize cross-boundary efforts that predate this initiative, as well as efforts in each state are building upon these existing partnerships, mechanisms, and programs going forward. And as I said before, there are no current significant changes to prioritization, planning, or implementation tied to shared stewardship as of now. And the opportunity is to continue to improve and expand partnerships, share decision-making space, and enhance coordination. And lastly, just the need for clear direction to ensure the longevity of shared stewardship. And with that, I will pass it to Ty.
Thank you, Destin. Yeah, so to kind of tie up the webinar, this anchor leg here, I'm going to talk about how some of the findings that were universal across phase one and phase 2 states, and then also some findings that were, I guess, unique to either one phase or the other, before transitioning to some factors that through our research and through the existing body of literature we believe will affect the future of shared stewardship, before kind of wrapping up and taking some questions. So next slide, please. So one of the big similarities between our phase 1 and phase 2 states is that our interviewees really saw that a goal for shared stewardship was to increase the pace and scale of forest management activities. Though there were though interviewees did express goals that were unique to their states and some goals that were more unique to their region, whether phase 1 or phase 2, this goal was universal. Interviewees saw that there was a need to increase the pace and scale of forest management. So some opportunities and challenges that they saw across the board. Interviewees saw that the formality and framework of shared stewardship was a really good thing. They all, pretty much all of our interviewees saw collaboration as a really positive thing, and that having this kind of aligned leaders' intent was going to be a really good step forward in trying to increase the pace and scale of forest management. A challenge, though, that was seen across the board was that state and federal land management agencies tended to lack the funding and capacity to complete large-scale management, even with shared stewardship and pooling resources. Our interviewers still saw that there were still gaps that needed to be made up, and that shared stewardship alone would not be enough to overcome the challenges that they face. Next slide, please. And so, as Jesse had mentioned earlier, this strategy doesn't have really any funding attached to it or any regulatory mechanisms attached to it. So what interviewees saw was really necessary was some strong leadership and effective communication throughout the chain to really align what leaders saw, at the more national level with what needed to happen at the field. And this was sorry, let me start that one more time. This was so that, there wasn't, I guess, something getting lost in translation down the line, since there weren't any, I guess, incentives to align in certain directions. Next slide, please. So some things that were different, though, between phase 1 and phase 2, notably the land ownership context is different. Though both interviewers in both phase 1 and phase 2 talked about the importance of reaching out to private land ownership, this emphasis was much stronger in the East, where land management agencies are not responsible for as large of a proportion of forest lands as land managers in the West. because land managers in the East did not manage as much forest land directly, this kind of leads into the second contrast, was that phase 2 states tended to believe they have collaborative forms because they had been having to practice collaboration for a long time previously, while phase 1 states, this was not to say that collaboration was new, but the structures to kind of go through joint prioritization and those types of processes weren't as well developed. Next slide, please. So when it came to institutional and organizational changes that were needed, phase 1 interviews showed some interest and more guidance on these collaborative structures that shared stewardship kind of, or the intent was to kind of build. And while phase 2 interviews felt equipped with collaboration with their current kind of suite of practices, but expressed desire for guidance on specific ways forward, a good way to think about this is that phase 1 interviewees believed that they knew where they needed to go. They needed, like their goals were pretty evident to them, but they didn't quite have the collaborative vehicle or the car to take them there. While phase 2 interviewees felt that their car was a well-oiled machine ready to go, they just needed more direction from high-level leadership on where exactly they should drive that car. Next slide. So when it comes to the future of shared stewardship, our interviewees and the current body of knowledge and literature really emphasizes that central knowledge brokers, such as the shared stewardship coordinators that Destin mentioned earlier, are going to be super important. They are really kind of what help facilitate cross-boundary work. They can kind of bridge those gaps and foster good communication pathways. Also, past collaborative history influences future success. For example, in Texas, they have the Texas Forestry Council, which has been around for the better part of a decade. And that is really what they're modeling shared stewardship on moving forward, while states such as Utah are developing new systems in order to kind of facilitate that joint prioritization process, because not that, like I said, not that collaboration is new over there, but they haven't had the structure such as the Texas Forestry Council to kind of facilitate those conversations. Also, interagency and partner relationships are really important. Collaboration, cross-boundary work, these are all, as Destin had mentioned earlier, really based on people and relationships. And when turnover occurs, that really negatively impacts those critical interactions and can set collaboration back a little ways. Next slide. All right. So looking forward, as you know, I kind of mentioned earlier, insufficient staff capacity in land management agencies is a barrier to increasing the pace and scale, regardless of this strategy. There is just going to need to be more funding and more staff coming down in these agencies in order to really ramp up to the scale that this strategy really kind of intends to reach. Also, private landowner outreach is going to be really critical in order to meet landscape objectives, not just in the East, where private land is over 90% of the kind of the forest holdings, but also in the West, with kind of the increase of the wildland urban interface into mountain areas of budding Forest Service land. And so, crucially, while there is doubt regarding the longevity of shared stewardship, it was a policy that was put forth by the previous administration, and as administration changes, so does language. Interviewees across the board in all states believe that the building effective partnerships across agencies and organizations is a really good thing to do, and it is here to stay regardless of who's leading the executive branch of the federal government. Next slide. And so just to kind of wrap this up and just really highlight and hammer home some of these fundamental persistent challenges that land management agencies face is that they still need increased support. They need more funding for staff and implementation so they can really scale up their operations in order to really manage forests at a landscape scale. And they need to maintain and improve existing capacity. A lot of the moves recently, well, I don't want to say recently, but over the last 20 or so years, there has been more, as agencies, their capacity shrinks, they've been contracting work out to other partners. And at this point, even those grants and agreement staff and contracting staff are getting stretched thin. So there just is a need to improve the staffing of these agencies, and there is a need to fund them at the scale required to do this type of work. And then that's pretty much the end of the webinar there. I want to say thank you and pass it back over to Jesse to kind of tie things up.
Thanks so much, Ty and Destin. Great job. Just wanted to thank everyone for being here, and we're happy to take questions now. I wanted to point out the project website here, which has all of our background information, publications, etc., as well as the contact information for the PIs and co-PIs on the project. I want to thank the Southern Fire Exchange for hosting us, and special thanks to David Godwin for coordinating all this. And of course, to the State and Private Forestry of the U.S. Forest Service for supporting this research. So at this point, we're happy to take any questions. Again, thanks everyone for being here. I guess maybe I'll turn over to David. I think David has a couple of closing thoughts to wrap up, if I'm not mistaken. So.
All right, thanks everybody. Thank you, Jesse and Ty and Destin. Appreciate your presentations. As y'all said, if you have questions for our speakers, you can type those questions into the Q&A tool in Zoom, and that'll allow us to get through those. And if other folks see questions that they would like us to get to, they can give those questions a thumbs up. That'll help us to prioritize and get to the most important questions. All right, so let's hop over here and see. All right, there's a question in the chat from Justin, and Justin says, if anyone has a project that they have done with a shared stewardship between the U.S. Forest Service and private, and then with U.S. Forest Service and tribal areas, would you please share with me? So I don't know if Justin is tied in with your team or not, but certainly if anybody else on the line would like to reach out to Justin, you can.
Yeah, and I'll just say, Justin, we are sort of trying to track these sorts of projects nationwide. So we're kind of keeping a running database of projects that at the very least seem to be in the spirit of shared stewardship, and in some cases may be kind of formally planned and implemented under the initiative. So yeah, feel free to be in touch, and we can kind of compare notes and see if, we probably each of us has a few projects that the other one's missing. So I'd be happy to share notes with you.
Right, I'll add a question. I noticed that you said that Florida had a shared stewardship coordinator position. I was curious to know if you got a sense if they were seeing progress by having somebody in that position, and or if you heard of other states who have a coordinator position.
If I'm not mistaken, I think the coordinator is here with us. When we did introduction, so Matthew Chop said he was the shared stewardship coordinator on the Osceola. So if I'm correct about that, maybe I'll defer to Matthew, to weigh in here and chime in about what you've done so far and what you've seen. I know you're probably not able to turn on your mic, but certainly feel free to add any details in the chat. I'll say the time we did these interviews, I think that position was just still being put together, if I'm not mistaken. So I don't know that we have any sort of kind of outcome measures from that. I will say that every state is essentially implementing this strategy a bit differently. There are several states, particularly out west, that have hired someone to act somewhat in that role, whether it's formally or informally the shared stewardship coordinator. There are also these regional level shared stewardship coordinators. And so I think that'll be an important question going forward as we continue to do case studies, is to kind of see, as Ty said, kind of what some of the key roles that folks are playing in these specific landscapes.
All right, thanks. Yeah, again, if y'all have questions for our speakers, you can put it in the Q&A tool in Zoom, or at this point we could put it in the chat too. That's easier. We've got space for it. It clearly there seems to be differences in the way it's rolling out, and the way it's being pulled together east and west, and then state to state. Did you get a sense as to, where is it? Are there states where it's already having the greatest impact, especially in the East? What are the ones that are standing out?
Good question. Maybe I'll ask Ty and Destin to think about that one as well. I think one of the things we found is that, our eastern states, as I mentioned, we did 7. 5 of them were in the essentially region 8, right? So the South, and then 1 was Nebraska, 1 was Massachusetts. Probably not a huge surprise to hear that Massachusetts and Nebraska were quite different in terms of their comparison to the region 8 states, right? So the region 8 states, essentially pretty robust forest industry, decades of activities, kind of forest harvesting and processing, et cetera. Massachusetts, interestingly, was one of the, if not the, might have been the first eastern state to sign, and yet it's a state that doesn't actually have any national forest land within its borders. So immediately we were kind of puzzled by that, thinking, well, why is Massachusetts signing? Why are they an early adopter if they don't even have national forest land within their boundaries? And so essentially a lot of that initiative in Massachusetts relates to that Mohawk Woodland Trails partnership. And the idea being that they want a sort of more formal vehicle for including the Forest Service as a partner in that initiative. Nebraska, Ty can speak to that better than I can, but essentially Nebraska does have national forest land, but in some cases it's a fairly distinct land cover type in the surrounding landscape. And so that creates some additional challenges. Nebraska doesn't have what you call a strong forest industry like Region 8. In terms of the Region 8 states, I don't know, Ty or Destin, do you want to weigh in? Was there a state that stood out to you as kind of having advanced their implementation of shared stewardship to date?
Yeah, I can weigh in. I was mainly responsible for the Region 8 states, which were pretty similar across the board. But one thing I did forget to mention in the presentation that I might as well, while we have time, mention is some of the efforts that are occurring in some of those Region 8 states. Ty mentioned the Texas Forestry Council, but there's also in Florida the ODO partnership, the Osceola to Ocala partnership, where public and private agencies are working together to connect that strip of land between those forests. There are examples in some of these states that are fairly new that fall under that umbrella of shared stewardship with existing prioritization process, as well as one we heard about in North Carolina and Georgia, the North Carolina data basin, where there's an open access tool where partners can draw up spatial data, as well as like discussion forums on things that are going. Right now it's just specifically North Carolina, but I know that in some of the Georgia interviews, they talked about how that could, be, whether it's that tool or something similar, could be helpful in Georgia. And then I'll let Ty talk about Nebraska and like the Corridor 385 project or any other like specific. But yeah, I would say for Region 8, everyone was pretty much on the same playing field of their intent for shared stewardship and what it was. I wouldn't say that any one state stood out more than the other. But yeah, Ty, if you want to talk about Nebraska or Massachusetts.
Yeah. Nebraska was interesting because it was probably the closest state that we looked at that kind of mirrored the Western process. And I think this was kind of the fact that Nebraska, the national forests in Nebraska are part of Region 2. And so they are under kind of the same, like Colorado had redone their state forest action plan with kind of going through the shared stewardship process before Nebraska. And I think that they kind of borrowed some of that process. It sounds like because they talked to the Region 2 shared stewardship coordinator who had been working on Colorado beforehand. But what Nebraska did is when we did at the time of our interviews, they were very still early on in this process, but they had between the state forest agency and the Forest Service kind of formed this joint prioritization committee. And they had come up with a few kind of key priorities that they wanted to focus on moving forward and kind of work and develop. But it was very early on. We did these interviews that I did in Nebraska were in the spring of 2021. And so they were very clear when we talked to them, just like, hey, yeah, we just started, we're working on it, and kind of expect things to develop over the next year. And Massachusetts shared stewardship in there with their Mohawk Trail Woodlands partnership, they saw it really as the Mohawk Trail Woodland Partnership had been around for a few years before that, and there had been a lot of efforts in the previous decade to kind of create that type of, collaborative governance scheme in Western Massachusetts, and they saw shared stewardship as a really good vehicle to kind of give legitimacy to the Forest Service working with them. And so the people that I talked to in Massachusetts were very complimentary of shared stewardship, and they were excited that it would give them more opportunity to work with the Forest Service.
We have some questions coming in. I just want to say I'm really excited to see that your team and the Western team as well, is y'all are using social science to analyze essentially fire management policy. And I think it's so we do lots of programs on fire science, and I don't think we do enough on the social science of fire science, both through our exchange and nationally. So I'm encouraged by the work that y'all are doing to address some really hard questions that have real implications on the ground nationally and at scales. So here's some questions that have come in. Dana asked, what are some of the reasons states gave for not entering MOUs? That's interesting. I don't know if you guys picked up on that along the way.
Yeah, so obviously our study design has a bit of a built-in bias in the sense that we only studied those states that had signed an MOU. So we didn't actually do any research in the non-signing states yet. I don't have a good guess on that. I think there's probably a combination of factors. I can imagine that for some states, they may have been waiting to see if this shared stewardship initiative had longevity, right? Whether it's going to survive the transition of administrations. And we have seen, I think, an uptick particularly in the east, of states signing MOUs after the new administration came in. I think once they saw, okay, the Forest Service is still supporting this isn't going away with the change in administration. So it may be that in some states, we'll see them continue to sign on in the future. Other than that, I would have to speculate, right? Which is probably not a great thing to do. So maybe I'll take the easy route and say it would be a great question for future research.
Here's a question that came in from Randall in the chat window, and Randall's asking if you could comment on where small private landowners or small timber owners, how would they benefit from shared stewardship? And I may expand on this and say, it sounded like in the Southeast, they were certainly interested in connecting more with private landholders in shared stewardship. Could you talk about both of those?
Absolutely, yeah. I think there's a lot of opportunity. Probably part of it's going to relate to how involved the landowner wants to be and whether they sort of share the same kind of vision for the landscape as some of the other partners. But I would say we've seen for a while now this kind of growing interest in planning, thinking, and managing across the traditional jurisdictional boundaries and the traditional property boundaries. And so we've seen that with policies like the Joint Chiefs Landscape Restoration Partnership, right, which funds projects that essentially cross the National Forest private boundary, with NRCS funding the project on the private side and the Forest Service funding on the National Forest side. We've seen policies like the Widen Authority, right, which allows the Forest Service to spend money outside of their essentially property boundaries if it benefits kind of watersheds inside the National Forest. And so I think for a while now, we're starting to see the kind of slow accretion of policies and programs that help kind of manage across those traditional property boundaries. So my sense is that, and I don't know which state Randall's located in, but my sense is that, I would say to look out for those opportunities to coordinate with the state forestry agencies, with the National Forests, and other public entities. I would also say there may be opportunities to get involved in some of these planning processes, whether that's related to the state forest action plans, whether it's related to some of these shared stewardship committees in states that have those, or other kind of partnership or kind of cooperative planning committees. I think my sense is almost all of these states and almost all of these locations, they're going to be really interested in hearing from private forest owners. They're going to want to include them, whether individually or through some sort of a forest owners association. So my sense is there'll be quite a bit of interest in that. I'll just close out by saying that even the CFLRP, the Collaborative Forest Landscape Restoration Program, it only funds projects on national forest land, but it encourages a landscape scale approach as well. And so I think almost any of these new policies that we see coming out having to do with kind of landscape scale thinking and restoration, there's going to be an attempt to engage those on the other side of the boundary from the federal owners.
We've got probably time for two more questions that we have here in the Q&A. I want to get to these. We're doing a little bit out of order. That's okay. One from Calvin just came in, and Calvin's asking, do you see a role for cooperative extension services in helping to connect private forest owners NGOs and others in shared stewardship. Have you seen that out west or in other states yet?
Boy, that's a great question. I certainly, I can't speak to the specifics. My sense is certainly in some of these states, those cooperative extension agents are going to be really front and center in helping to be these sort of nodes within the network, these bridges, right? And that's something Ty brought up in his comments toward the end there, that, you know, as we continue to work in these networks rather than working within our kind of silos, there's a real need for these bridge builders, for these sort of nodes in the network. And so I think cooperative extension agents is kind of a slam dunk as far as someone who has those networks, understands the issues, and can build those bridges across different partners, as well as, you know, just at the plug for the fire exchanges and the fire learning networks. I mean, these are the kinds of organizations that I think increasingly are going to be important in playing this coordinating role, translating, kind of building those bridges. So I can't speak to the specifics. I'm sure in some of these states that those cooperative extension agents have been quite actively involved, and even in the states where they haven't to date, my sense is going forward there should be a lot of opportunity for that. So.
All right, and one last question, and this is an interesting one looking into the future. Christian writes in and says, going forward, what would you consider as a quantitative measure of success of shared stewardship, particularly in the Eastern US?
Yeah, great question. Honestly, that's a question we asked of our interviewees, you know, with this question of performance metrics, right? We all know that the agencies essentially run on their performance metrics, right? There's things they're supposed to show that they've done every year and show that they're earning their budget. You know, this idea of coordinating with others, coordinating across boundaries, coordinating across jurisdictions, that can complicate the, you know, kind of meeting those metrics. So my sense, again, I'm going to give you sort of a very academic non-answer, so I apologize in advance. I think we're still working towards that. I think there's still a lot of conversations happening right now around how do we capture the value in some of the hard work it takes to build these partnerships and to work across boundaries, knowing that it may have an effect on what we normally think of as sort of the bean counting we do at the end of every year to show what we've accomplished. You know, there are certainly some tools out there that I think help, that are designed to help facilitate that. You know, the Shared Stewardship Initiative was originally built with a strong emphasis on this scenario planning portfolio tool by the U.S. Forest Service. I think that attempts to sort of capture quantitatively what's the sort of outcomes of different landscape scale treatments might be. There's this talk of using the pods, the delineations for essentially wildfire management. So I think there's, I guess, again, I'm going to give you somewhat of an academic non-answer and say, I think there are a lot of opportunities out there. I think we're still kind of having that conversation. And it's something that a lot of people are thinking about right now. So I don't have a great sort of answer for you other than to say that it's one of those pieces we'll be looking at as this research goes forward.
All right, well, thank you all so much. I appreciate your time today. We have run up pretty much to the end of our time allotment. Jesse, Ty, Destin, do you have, after we've gone through all these questions, do y'all have any other parting thoughts that you'd like to share with anybody about your project going
Ty,
forward?
I'll turn over to you first. Any parting thoughts, Ty?
Well, just to kind of tag on to what you were just saying, Jesse, about the performance metrics, I think it's also just to add to the complexity of that. Shared stewardship, to measure it quantitatively, I mean, so many of these metrics are based on specific objectives, and objectives across the different states are very different. I mean, increasing the pace and scale of management is kind of this broad umbrella term, but they're managing for different things. And so I just wanted to put my 2 cents in there and say, like, it is a complex problem. And it's definitely the question that when I would ask in interviews, I could definitely tell someone, kind of give an exhale and be like, huh, it's a good question. It's a pickle. It's a tough one. And I will second what Jesse says, that there's a lot of opportunity and there's a lot of people working on it right now. But.
Great. Destin, any parting thoughts?
Just that, you know, it seems like there's already a lot of existing good work going on, and this is only going to further that. And no matter the change in leadership or whatever, it seems like the intent of shared stewardship and the things that it stands for are going to definitely be important going forward in all these states.
Yeah, and I'll just say my parting thought is thanks everyone for your time and attention here, and please feel free to be in touch. You know, we'd love to hear from you. If you have ideas, if you have suggestions, please do let us know. We're interested in hearing your thoughts on this.